Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to another episode of the Simpa Life Podcast. It is episode 78, folks. We are ticking ever closer to our first century, on our way to our first 1,000, on our way to, I'm not going to live long enough for 1,000,000, so you might get 1,000 out of me. We'll see yet. It's a very special weekend this weekend, although I say this weekend, you're seeing this next week. So this weekend was a very special weekend. It's a once in a 3-decade occurrence where the Abrahamic faith's major holidays all align over the same weekend. So that is the Jewish faith, the Islamic faith, and the Christians all have a holiday that intersects within the weekend that has just been. So if you are of faith, I do hope you had a good one. If you are of one of the faiths that are not part of the Abrahamic trifecta, if trifecta is even a word, I think Pineapple Express has really affected my language there, guys. I mean, the film, not the cultivar. Well, they probably both have as well, actually, over my lifetime. But my point being, whatever your faith is, even if you have no faith, if you have faith in something, nothing at all, please, I hope you've had a wonderful week. So we are now dead into summer. I wish it was summer. Spring, sorry. The year is moving ahead, so I thought we would catch up on a conversation that we were supposed to have last year with two very important bills that were occurring. I wanted to get on a guest who has some sort of experience in policing, in authoritative institutions, and an understanding of kind of what the implications and ramifications of these could be. So it is his second appearance. He was back first on the podcast way back in December 2020. On episode number 8, and he is one of the most prolific former undercover drug detectives in the UK. He was on the front line of the war on drugs in the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s, the British war on drugs. After recognizing the harms of his actions in his career and facing CPTSD, he had a sort of a volte-face, as it were, in his approach and decided to start advocating for an end to the war on drugs, sensible drug policies, and to speak of his direct experience. He has since become a public speaker and a board member of LEAP, which is now rechanged its name from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition to Law Enforcement Action Partnership, I think is the correct name these days. He's also written 2 wonderful books, which I will tag below, which you should check out, guys. They are Good Cop, Bad War and Drug Wars, written with J S Rafaeli, who is currently doing a series on Vice at the minute you should check out, which I will also tag below. Without further ado, he's Neil Woods. How are you doing, brother?
Hey, Simpa, how's it going, man?
I'm good. That was a lot of words for the opening sentences. I'm pretty happy I got that out. So yeah, I'm good. As I explained to you sort of in the preamble for this, I'm a bit tingling there, between properties at the minute and trying to figure out kind of where I stand. But it is a good refresher and reminder and a stoic kind of lesson to learn of why I do what I do. So I think I'm well. I see you're enjoying your time in space at the minute.
Yeah, I thought, why not? Why not be in space? Because I've just moved house, so I've got nowhere really comfortable to sort of sit and do podcasts at the minute. So I'm making the use of these backgrounds. I think I had a Hawaiian beach the other day for an interview, but I think being in space is more appropriate today.
I like it. Wait, I was going to make a joke about your living room has got quite a bit of space, but yeah, we'll go with what we've got there. Well, yeah, man, I suppose I'm going to signpost most people here back to episode 8 because we covered basically the entirety of your career, and we spoke quite in depth of your time within the policing institution here in the UK. But I just thought, could you give us a bit of an overview? I know it's quite hard to say. Could you shove your life into like a few sentences, but just an overview to kind of give people an introduction and some context to the conversation?
Yeah, okay. So I used to catch drug dealers for a living as an undercover cop. In order to do that, I used to manipulate vulnerable people to get them to do what I wanted. And if that sounds ruthless, well, yes, it is ruthless. That is essentially what drugs policing is. It's ruthless. And, as a young man, I believed in what I was doing, but the evidence before my eyes eventually made me realize that all I was doing was causing severe harm, not just to individuals, but also communities and wider society as a whole. So I then I realised I was duty bound to speak out against that and do my best to use my knowledge and experience to persuade the wider public of the folly and viciousness of the war on drugs. So, as you've just said, I'm now part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I'm on the board for the organisation in the States and currently working on growing the organisation in Europe.
Excellent. Yeah, I noticed on your little Zoom name below that says Leap Europe. So I suppose then give us a bit of an insight to then what is Leap? I mean, why did it change its name the other year, and what is Leap Europe?
Okay, well, Leap, we are essentially a collection of police and other law enforcement people around the world who are campaigning for an evidence-based drug policy, an end to the war on drugs. It started in the United States in 2002 when five former cops decided to, for much the same reasons as me, they realised that they'd only been causing harm, and they started Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Now, the reason that the organisation changed as it grew in America in particular was because, it's politics 101. You're not against something. If you want to be politically influential, you've got to change from being a protest group into a political advocacy group. And it's interesting because so many people say, no, I like the old name better. But the people who like the old name better are the people that were always going to support us because they were always on our side, But we're not interested in the people who love the name for what it was. We're interested in the people who don't yet realise that they're on our side. That they don't yet realise that there are personal reasons for them to take, to try and end this war on drugs. So it's about reaching a broad political audience, and it works. It's made a massive difference to our growth, both nationally in the United States and also internationally. There are some parts of Leap which still use the old name, most notably Germany. And I think they went through such a process of launching in their media with the old name that they don't have the appetite to take it on at the moment. And Leap Australia, who insist that it's the best name for them culturally, I'm not convinced, but it doesn't matter. We're all still part of the same Leap family. We're all still part of the same team. And in terms of that team, at the moment, we're growing across Europe. And to do that, we're having a series of launch events in various countries. We've done 2 of them already. We did the one in Paris, in which we engaged with the presidential election in terms of drug policy. And just last weekend, we had one in Barcelona. And that was really, really successful. We had a politician, a member of parliament on the panel as a former military cop. We had a serving police inspector from Barcelona on the panel, a former undercover cop who used to infiltrate the cartels in Latin America. It was an extraordinary event. We had national coverage from 2 national newspapers, really big circulation. And we've really stirred things up in Spain, which is fantastic. We had our close allies in Barcelona who helped support it and actually filmed it for us was the Association of the Cannabis Social Clubs, which are they are a great bunch of people. They really are. And I'm very, very grateful for their support and care. They really looked after us when we were in Barcelona. So showed us one of their wonderful, wonderful clubs. So I'm really pleased to be working with them, and we will, Leap in Spain will continue to grow. I met one of the people in the audience for the gig was actually on day release. He had to go back to prison at night, and he was on prison for supplying to cannabis social clubs, which is absurd because the Spanish model, the system there is so good. It's so good for communities. It's so good for social equity. But the police are still persecuting people, and it's a lottery whether people get prosecuted or not. So that was one of the issues that we tried to address there. We tried to make it clear to the Spanish public that, they're already showing leadership there. they need to go that step further and properly regulate. And, at least because we're a European-wide organisation, a worldwide organisation, we were able to give them words of warning from other countries where things are not being done as well as they are in Spain. Because there is a backlash going on at the moment in Spain politically, where some politicians are saying that the cannabis social club model should end. There should be more clampdowns, bigger prison sentences, get tough policies, more policing, all the same kind of shit, really. Mm-hmm. So we think that our intervention has really neutralised that aggressive political move at the moment, because we got such good coverage, and we sparked such debate, amongst Mossos and the other national police as well. Mm-hmm. That event was really successful. The next ones. We're doing one in Amsterdam in June, and again, much for the same reason. There's a political backlash against the coffee shops, and it needs to go in the regulation direction, mm-hmm. because at the moment there's a genuine political concern that the culture there is seriously under attack. So we'll be challenging that, and then we're going to be going to Helsinki. Helsinki is an important place for social justice and social justice issues, because a lot of the great social justice policy ideas come out of Finland. For example, Housing First, which is a very important social policy. So when we've got really good allies there, really good allies indeed. So that's going to be a great event. And we've got others. We're going to be doing one in London, and then we'll culminate these series of events in Vienna at the United Nations next March.
Excellent. Wow, it's great to hear that there is such movement, and it was something obviously we were speaking about just before we started recording. Sorry, pardon me. Apologies for that, folks. This is not an ASMR podcast, so I do apologize if that came through the microphone. Yeah, it's great to see this movement and this collectivism, as you were speaking of before, that it creates champions in regions, and then Leap Europe as an overarching entity can go and create the support. And I think it's wonderful that you are able to work with the association of cannabis social clubs out in Spain, because exactly that, they've become under attack in recent years with attempts to air quote clarify certain grey areas within interpretations of legislation. So this has meant that there's been crackdowns sort of here and there. There are, on the flip side of it, there's a hell of a lot of good that is done by these institutions. There were a few of them that were kind of infiltrated by international cartels that were then starting to use the clubs as a way to centralize supply to ship out to other regions. I mean, there's probably some of my listeners right now know how to get into those supply chains. But then, so this created a bit of a backlash in the community itself. And I think some corners may have sought more regulation, and in doing that drew a light to the current system, which had existed kind of in a blind spot to a lot of the politicians. They live in a short cycle. They come and go every few years. So unless you're informed, you're not aware. So all of a sudden, this was brought to the forefront, and these conversations were had. There's obviously the major raid that went down at the start of lockdown in the north of Spain around the seed suppliers. There was then obviously another huge raid has just gone down in northern Spain, I think a few weeks ago. I'm not going to quote the numbers because I can't remember them off the top of my head, but it was some quite dramatically large numbers, as there often are in these sort of style raids. So it shows there is this change, and unfortunately there wasn't for a while in Spain a great movement towards protection in law. Let's fight for true legislative change. And the same, I think, is true in Amsterdam, in that the coffee shops fought for such discretion and were given, again, I'm not going to pronounce the word, but it's basically a Dutch thing that means look the other way. System that meant that air quote soft drugs were allowed to kind of tacitly exist and be supplied, and they were kind of regulated through commercial means rather than through drug policy means. But I think that, again, the Dutch and have kind of fallen behind in that they've not advocated for something that would truly protect them. They had the backdoor supply problem. We were talking about this on the episode just last week with Mealy Janssen, of how 500 grams can be on site, but it can't ever get onto the site. You know, a person can buy five grams and walk with it on the street, but then you can't. There's so many other holes and areas within the law that a lot of the people, I think, kind of got complacent. And I don't mean this as a point of contention against them. I just mean that I think that when something works, you think if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I think the world has moved on so fast that these little hubs are in a position that they could get left behind. So to know that organizations like LEAP, which are basically legislative focused, as in you are fighting for active change that will occur in law, rather than just these kind of tacit de facto decriminalizations or other kind of discretionary policies.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you're right, of course, the world has moved on, but more importantly, politics is moving on as well. There is a shift towards the autocratic everywhere, and that's a risk to everybody. And, you know, if you consider people, obviously Putin is obviously at the forefront of everyone's mind for the autocratic demagogue at the moment. But, you know, you've got Orban and all sorts of right-wing shifts in terms of autocracy. You know, the way that we fight that autocracy in terms of our attacks on civil liberties and human rights is actually through drug policy. It's the most effective way that we can prove a liberal democracy works. It's now become the ultimate tool in defending the values of our liberal democracy. We need to start seeing it in those terms. You know, Putin made that infamous speech at the G20 in 2019 that liberal democracy was now obsolete. And that cry was taken up by all sorts of people around the world, you know, from Brazil to Hungary to Poland. And, you know, the way that we fight that onslaught, freedom, the freedom to do what we want with our own mind and body is the core value that we can do to fight off the autocratic wave.
Couldn't agree more. Exactly. That's what I've always advocated from day one, is that if we can arrive at a point of understanding that somebody's behavior, for all, even if it is self-destructive to themselves, it is still their prerogative to do so. It is, if we are to have these governing societies, they are to reduce the harms that anything can inflict on an individual and maximize the benefits of something. And yeah, we obviously have got a new drug that's come out of Russian oppressive drug policies, and that's that crocodile, that homemade heroin synthetic substitute. Have you seen this? Yeah.
It's the solvent they use to make it's petrol, which is rather unpleasant. Yeah. In fact, the new you mentioned at the start the war on drugs films from Vice that are all researched and written by J S Rafaeli. The latest one that dropped about 3 or 4 days ago is actually features crocodile. It's all about Putin and how international drug policy is a geopolitical tool for it. Good, recommend it.
Interesting. That's fortuitously timed then. Yeah, I've really been enjoying the series. I must admit, JS is somebody who I've spoken to once. I think last year when Vice were putting together some projects, but definitely someone I would love to get on the podcast, because yeah, his breadth of knowledge is quite impressive, and he really understands, again, the international intersectionality of, you know, how geopolitics and drug supply, they are so intertwined, as you sort of spoke of before, that I believe that the first action to help the people is to, not punish them for something that you deem immoral or reprehensible. You know, it has to be that kind of humanist approach. I mean, we had Jeff Smith, MP, on actually the other week, and he's a humanist, and got me thinking after that. And so I've been away sort of looking since, and actually their kind of philosophies, I think, are quite decent to apply overarching to a society, because we have the issue of still, as quite a Christian country in the UK, we have this moralizing of drugs, and it seems to be that whereas in Russia's, for all there's still the religious kind of slant to it, it is this argument of weakness, almost, that weak people take drugs, and that it's kind of accounted masculine, which is somehow harmful to the nationality. There is this kind of, you can really see, and I'm sorry for the term of it, but small man syndrome in Putin being then exercised as part of the cultural identity in Russia. Yeah,
I mean, it's also important to note that he's making the same moral judgment about drug consumption as he is about people who are homosexual. And again, it's always very important that we equate those two things. It's about moral judgment of other people, a minority of people, and we shouldn't lose focus of that. But you mentioned MPs and the fact that supposedly we're a Christian country in the UK, but actually we're not a Christian country anymore. And this is an interesting aspect of the gulf of thinking between politicians and the general public, is that it's I can't remember the numbers, but I think it's as low as 10% of the general population, if I remember right, actually identifies as Christian, whereas or religious at all. Whereas it's something close to 60% of MPs. MPs are substantially much more likely to be religious and hold much stronger religious views than the general public. So they're not representative of the public. And I've observed this for a few years, and I'm constantly in geeky fashion thinking, why do things move slower than we want them to? And why are politicians often behind the general public in terms of views on drugs? And that's one of the answers, I think, is that there is a staunch clinging on to moral judgment as a result of a firm basis of religious belief within Parliament that doesn't exist in the wider public. So the wider public are therefore more flexible and pragmatic when it comes to decisions about what people do with their own mind and body, because they don't have the same levels of moral judgment. Now, I know that's a big load of sweeping statements, but the evidence is there to back up that in terms of how many MPs are religious.
Yeah, it's interesting. I quickly gave it a Google as you were talking there, and from the British Social Attitude Survey from 2018, which is the most recent, 52% of the UK public said that they do not belong to any religion. 38% identified as Christian, 9% as other faiths. There's a further breakdown of the 52%, stating that up to 40.2% are recognized as atheists. Of this, 30% of them are agnostics, whereas about 10% of them are I can't even pronounce it, antithesis. So they don't believe in any theoretical sort of God construct. Which, yeah, I think, again, that shows the attitudes have changed. I mean, now we're in this odd weekend. I said to you before that I felt spacey because it's been a bank holiday weekend. It's been a Friday and a Monday. So it's been a bit weird that you can't go to certain shops, you can't go out and do certain things, and everybody seems to all go, let's go garden, or we'll go do whatever. We're supposed to eat fish on a Friday and all of these different things. And so we're kind of running through the motions of this pageantry of religious garb, but none of us are subject to the substance of it. But then when they're pushed, people will rather say that they are Christian or agnostic and would believe at the last minute, as it were, in the idea of the Christian Jesus sort of idea, that construct of the very basic Sunday school teachings of the Bible. And that says, drugs are bad, the Adam and Eve and all those other very simplistic teachings that have caused these, as they evolve, homophobia, they cause, this kind of misogyny, they cause this kind of otherizing, this demonization of anything that isn't part of your shroud of individuals, So it's interesting that basically, they're overrepresented by 50% in the chambers of Parliament than they are in the population. Because then I wonder how many of the other 40% are openly atheists, for example. I mean, it's something that's joked about in America is you can be president without God. And it's not that God makes you president, it's you've got to thank God along the way, because otherwise you ain't going to get voted in. Whereas it's kind of different over here. I think the religious kind of, I don't want to say indoctrination, but belief structure and the propensity for it and the fact that it pervades so much against the political population is probably due to the fact that of the institutions they go through, of Eton and Oxford. They're very small academic institutions that, again, themselves are quite still tied to the religious state, because then the economic interests of both are represented when they are disproportionately elected to power.
Yeah, true. And obviously, religion is a significantly much more important political force in America, especially the sort of thread of Protestant Puritanism, which essentially gave us this war on drugs in the first place, and the prejudice that's linked to it. But it's still there. It's still an influence in the UK Parliament in terms of just how strong some people have their views. But it's worth pointing out, though, those that moralise from a Christian perspective should really note that there's no prejudice against homosexuals or drug use in the gospel.
Exactly. Even more so, it's the story of like Moses and the burning bush and whatever else. There's quite a few analogies or allegories that could be stated to be interactions with common drugs at the time that were part of the cultures, but then weren't, as you say, full moralized and demonized within the texts of the major religions or ways of thinking at the time. And there's a certain paradox here with Christianity in I think of the Bill Hicks joke, and he says something offensive to sort of Christians, and they get pissed off, and he goes, yeah, what are you going to do? Forgive me? And it always makes me think that that's what Jesus taught. The Bible teaches is forgiveness. So then if you can identify that someone has then, as you would identify, sin, or they have a problem, surely the point is to then offer guidance and assistance and help, not condemnation, not incarceration, not writing off their life. And that's nothing against any Christian, sorry, out there. I'm just speaking of the abstract faith. Sorry, go on.
I think Bill Hicks is a much more worthy is a worthy person to put someone's worship and faith into if they wanted to look for any figure in our history. I do love Bill Hicks.
I'd agree. Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, I sent us off on a tangent there. So you wanted to ask me about some legislation and stuff.
Yeah. Oh no, it's here. We got plenty of time. I wanted to just ask you general questions about policing that I didn't get to ask you as well last time, about just what I guess mulls around in my brain. So I'm going to jump forward a bit and then we'll go backwards in terms of my very long list of notes for today's recording. Is policing inherently classist in the areas that are policed that have crime, if crime of necessity, say theft, petty theft, things like that, of sort of crimes of substance, and that's a very poor way of doing it, but non-financial crimes, none of the kind of high-end blue collar, but the kind of antisocial behavior crimes, there you go, I think is a better way of framing it. They are, in my opinion, disproportionately over policed, and I think that is brought out in the numbers and in the media's depiction of the fact that you will see council estates with, big cameras on towers. You'll see the police vans driving through constantly. I mean, I can't go 10 minutes, even with me staying here, without hearing a siren going up and down a road. Whereas then if you live in an affluent area, you hear a siren, everyone's on Facebook into the private group and everyone's like, oh, what's happening in Deirdre? Has anyone seen, and it's such a two worlds apart. Or is that just my classist, in my inherent classism anyway? Sorry.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's quite clear that poorer neighbourhoods are policed more heavily than the richer ones. I don't think that's complicated, and I think it's borne out by the evidence. However, I would just temper that a slight bit by pointing out that the bulk of the population are poorer, and that disproportionate policing can also, to a degree, be explained by the proportion of population that live in one place or another. So I'm saying yes and no there. Although I am aware from a criminologist's point of view that poorer areas are policed more heavily. But if you bear in mind, there's a fascinating statistic from the first state that went legal for cannabis, Colorado, in the States. And I was fascinated by these statistics because I always wondered if the racist drive, as in the thing that drove the disproportionate nature of policing, the fact that black people were picked on more than white, was actually a significant feature of drug policy specifically, rather than a broader drive within policing. And that's why I was fascinated by the statistics, that there was significantly less black people searched by police after they had legal regulated markets. Substantially, the numbers are massive. And in fact, it was reduced by 90%. 90% less black people searched after legal cannabis. Now that's incredible. That's great for communities and that's great for society. People are being policed less. But the percentage, as in the racial disparity, stayed exactly the same. Exactly the same, which I was disappointed with because I like to have my theories proved right. But it's still really fascinating and encouraging for reformers because, okay, so the racism still exists. You still got the same proportion of black people versus white people being stopped. but 90% less people are being stopped. That's 90% less. That's like a massive drop in policing overall. Yeah. The society is being policed less. So there is less interaction between the public and police. So there's less things that can go wrong. There's more opportunity to take time and build trust between police and community, because there isn't that interaction, which is eroding trust. Yeah. So whatever the section of society which is being policed, the answer, again, comes down to changing our drug laws.
Yeah, we agreed. Then I think that is a wonderful way to look at it, in that there is still, obviously, as you say, the disparage between different races and different economic classes, but an overall reduction of something like 90%, is massive. What I think alarms me, and I think alarms a lot of other people when you think of it, going, as you said, that's 90% less policing, but it's not. It's 90% on the streets, direct interaction, using manipulation of tactics to be able to create social control, for lack of a better way of describing it. I then worry what that time and effort and resource and energy is then being spent on in other avenues. I mean, and this is obviously going to show my bias. Obviously, I am criminalized in this country because of the actions I participate in. I am criminalized. Obviously, it's, as I've been told by police, it's not a case of being criminalized, it's a case of being caught. You are not a criminal until prosecuted. So it's an interesting game that I guess has been created here, in that if you are then criminalized, you're then created to be bad people. You're therefore, society would say, more inclined to do more bad things. But then on the flip side of this, then it creates this police are good people and do good things. And we're starting to see, obviously, in the wake of the murder of Sarah Everard here in the UK, people are starting to look at policing private lives, as it were. How then policing, I'm getting ahead of myself, how the impact of police officers doing their job affects their private lives in terms of mental health, in terms of addiction, in terms of domestic abuse. So I'd be interested to see, actually, on the Colorado statistic, if then 90% less of those direct interactions like that, whether that reduces any of the domestic violence or the propensity of officers to, abuse alcohol or other borderline substances.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting because police still have to attend traumatic things. And the thing, the thing that people need to understand is that the police are dealing with traumatic things all of the time. And, I'm working on this topic with some allies in order to eventually do some public-facing work on this. Police are traumatized. The police and other emergency responders as well, fire service and ambulance, for example, they see and experience more traumatic things on a scale that, in ways that the public will never even come into contact once, let alone hundreds of times. And that has an impact. And we need to understand how trauma impacts on our behavior, our functionality as human beings, and how that can create a sort of feedback loop. We're not going to tackle policing without having some kind of sympathy and understanding for what police have to go through. That might be a very unpopular thing to say with an audience such as yours, with lots of people who've been persecuted by police because of the current drug laws. But we have to look at this in the broadest possible way, and the causes for that. But let me give you an example of how things could drastically change if our drug laws changed in terms of the policing resources. Back at the end of the 2000s, as a conventional detective and detective sergeant, I was amazed by some wonderful things that were going on within policing. And one of those was a specialism called the Domestic Violence Unit. Now, the DVU, as it was then, was people who were literally specialising in looking after the victims of domestic violence. They developed such a skill set, and they were constantly developing how better to support victims right from the outset. And they would stay with them. They would stay attached to them as a friend, to support them, to look after their needs, both for prosecution, whatever. And that specialism was impressive, really impressive, which meant for me as an investigator, I could rely on that witness or victim being looked after. And it was starting to make the dealing with serious domestic violence much more efficient And we were leading the world in the UK because of it. 2010, the first cuts happened. The first austerity cuts happened. And the first thing to go was the domestic violence unit, because having cops in a specialist unit that only do that job doesn't provide much business flexibility when you've got cuts. So it's what went straight away. And all of that expertise in those people that have been built up, and they were sharing expertise with other similar people, disappeared. It's gone. It's gone forever. Because if you want to set up a unit like that again, you've got to start from scratch. Those people have moved on. They don't, gone. Now, policing was cut back. So you've got specialist rape trained officers, all of the people who, where specialisms really add value and care to the people who need it. They were all stripped back. And as more and more cuts happened, policing was just stripped back to a reactive institution. But the one thing that was never cut back on in most constabularies is drug investigations. Now, it was in Durham, because Ron Hogg and Mike Barton could see quite clearly that drug policy, that the drug laws, it's just like pissing money up the wall, because it doesn't reduce crime. And they understood that, and they did the same in some other constabularies. But for the most part, in most places where people live in the UK, it didn't change at all. So you lost all of these specialisms, all of these things that could genuinely improve communities and people's lives, but they still put money into our drug laws. So, when I say about reducing the amount of contact between police and a persecuted minority of the population, there are such broad benefits to redirecting those resources elsewhere. And this is why I get so frustrated by the rather inane statements in the States to defund the police movement, because most importantly, it's a shit messaging. It's awful messaging, which only shoots the reform movement in the foot, because it alienates small C conservative audiences. It's completely stupid to use that phrase.
It's the same as against that you were speaking of before. It takes a negative stance against something.
Yeah, but it's even worse, because it defund the police. It just scares people, What we should be doing is defunding the drug war, because then we can make police do what they need to do and where they can actually help people more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I wanted to jump back onto with the I was kind of leading with the question earlier of policing being classist, I guess, is Partygate. I didn't really understand Partygate too much, because I was kind of out of the political cycle until I was due to do the Spectator's podcast. Of all institutions, the Spectator kind of reached out to me. And they got in contact the day before. We're having to cancel this. Partygate is taking over the news cycle. What the hell is Partygate? Bit of a Googling, and obviously look around. There's 50 plus parties that have obviously occurred within Parliament and in Downing Street, while the rest of us were all locked up, and people were, legally prevented from seeing their families, from seeing, relatives that then ultimately died. Relationships fell apart. Housing became insecure, jobs were lost. Billions were striked from the economy, and yet these guys had cheese and wine every Friday, and every day they walked past police in Downing Street. Every day they were guarded by police, and at no point did the police enforce the legislation that they were enforcing for everyone else. How can something like that occur?
Well, I mean, the cops who stand on the front door, they're given a job. They're not given a job to investigate. I can understand how, the compartmentalisation of policing means that they're just not going to take any notice of what goes on in their house. Because, I mean, I've been in 10 Downing Street, and, the people who staff the front door, they just staff the front door. they don't have the run of the place. So I don't know. But yeah, but having said that, of course, I mean, the whole thing's corrupt, isn't it? I couldn't go to my sister's funeral because I was following the rules. My family had to follow the rules, and they were partying at that time. And I'll never forgive them for that. Now, I'm non-partisan. I'm a single issue person. I've got allies in each. We've got allies in every party, but it doesn't matter what party it is. I'll never forgive that. And I think the majority of the voting public are not going to forgive that when it comes to an election. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, I think very much so. It's interesting as well. There was I did a little bit of a Google earlier, just of other search engines are available, and I do actually recommend other search engines because screw Google. I probably didn't even use Google. I was probably using DuckDuckGo, but it's so within my vernacular these days. About policing, and I did see a clip from, is it Grant Shapps, the transport secretary, basically fumbling his way through stating maybe police were in some situations a bit heavy-handed with enforcement of COVID rules. So again, this conversation's been brought up in the narrative because Bojo and others are paying like a 50 quid fine. Yeah, there's some guy who opened a gym who's paying 56,000. There's people who just went for walks that have got several hundred. There are all kinds of discrepancies that have been created, that it's creating this disenfranchisement and disrespect and detachment of the voting populace from the people that were apparently voted into this position anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not equal, as you say. Policing is not equal, but the policing of politicians has always been a tricky thing. No one really seems to know what to do they, really? But I mean, if you look at the weighting in terms of the way that the Met investigates different politicians, I mean, if you look at Jenny Jones, she was spied on. You don't see any Conservative MPs or Lords spied on. So, even the institutions are weighted differently in terms of their political intent.
Mm. So again, I guess with everything that we've spoke of there, with Partygate, with the kind of the revelations since the Sarah Everard case of, I think I saw the statistic earlier. I'll include it in the bio below, guys, in the links below, because I can't pull it out of my ass right now, but I think it's about half. I think the prosecution rate for domestic abuse in the UK is somewhere like 6.5%, whereas in policing ranks, it's 3.2, something like that. But it's about 50% less. So I was wondering then, we've heard in the wake of this boys club of an institutional misogyny within, obviously this came out of the Met and other major metropolis institutions. It may be less in more rural policing areas, but there does seem to be this culture of sort of misogyny and of this, like you said, of this unselective enforcement of policing. Can policing as it stands ultimately be reformed? I mean, when you look at one of the things we discussed in episode 8 of Sir Robert Peel and the Peelian principles, that blueprint for what policing is versus what policing is in the 21st century, are they compatible? Is it possible to reform this, basically?
It's definitely possible to reform it, but it's going to take a lot of serious analysis, because you can't deny that misogyny exists in a strong thread within policing. You can't. But it does reflect wider society. But the trouble is with policing, it's such an intense occupation that what it does reflect in wider society, it tends to reflect in a more intense fashion. But again, I bring it back to our drug laws, that police still spend more time on drugs than they do anything else. And that's even considering that there has been a reduction in the amount of drugs policing that's gone on in most parts of the country. You can only spend resources to study yourself, to actually review and work out how to reform. If you stop spending money on things that just waste resources and don't reduce crime, it all comes down again to the drug laws. That's the starting point for any reform.
Indeed, and I think that everything else is just throwing money on the fire, because ultimately everything is linked. Oh, let's try and tackle antisocial behavior in the local area. Well, that's probably got something down to the fact that a lot of the youth are running around and they got a little bit of weed and they maybe got some speed and they got some cider they got from the shop, you know what I mean? And there's no social services, there's no whatever there. And again, you can then look at the economic deprived areas of region of then intergenerational joblessness, of intergenerational sort of a lack of wealth, and actually degradation of wealth, and watching families slip further and further into poverty are a direct consequence of, because that area is then deemed to have significant drug problem, is therefore more over policed, therefore the housing prices drop, therefore the economic opportunities and advantages of the non-consuming populace in the area is therefore harmed. They therefore then leave the situation, then gets better. You can understand these models and how this all occurs. The issue I found, and what I found quite upsetting in a way, I guess, was speaking to Jeff Smith about all of the different APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups and bodies that are set up within Parliament, but none of them talk to each other. So you've got a homeless group over here and a drug group over here, and then you've got the Economic Forum here and these guys over here, and none of them are talking. And they were stuck in these microcosms, these little chambers where they're trying to set policy from, yes, a very informed base of their sphere of knowledge, but not connected to the other spheres of society. And I think until we have that, I don't know, a board, a council, a committee put together that actually has a representative of every one of these entities and shows the intersectionality and the crossover between it. Because the only way you're going to deal with, the homeless that decide to be homeless, it's probably down to the fact you're not going to let them do drugs, you're going to take their pets away, you're going to try and move them 400 miles away from their support networks. Do you know what I mean? It has to be that empathy first. And I think that, as you said, drug policy reform, I think, has to come first. And for me, I'm a radical. I say tear up motor, deschedule everything now, regulate the commercial application and access. There are already wonderful models that have been presented by organizations like Transform and others. The safe consumption site record is phenomenal. No one has ever died anywhere in the world in a safe consumption site using intravenous drugs. Yet how many thousands die every year in countries around the world because of a lack of that basic access? And that's even still step one. There's far more radical policies I think can be developed. And I'm not sure where I stand on police, because I am one of those people you spoke of. I am persecuted, vilified, because I choose to consume a drug that benefits my life personally, mentally, emotionally, and through my own health. I choose to take that autonomy, but I also then choose to stand up and try and fight for others to recognize, as yourself does, that this is wrong, that change needs to occur. But I'm conflicted, as I say. I love my conversations with you because it keeps me connected with there are humans in those uniforms. They are people at the end of the day, and I have to try and remember that. I think I'd say the same if anyone listening to this or watching this. When the war is over, we will have to live with them. When they will no longer kick your door in, they will no longer be a threat to you. Yeah, there's going to be a long period of time where that blue light will still send that shiver up your spine. You've seen that uniform or hearing that down coming around from around the corner, that noise of a radio. There's still going to be the consequences of this. But I think both sides of this, as you said, are damaged and harmed by it. And there needs to be, I've pitched before, a truth and reconciliation committee when people get together and are actually able to admit and truly discuss what the hell has gone on, because it is far worse than any of us know. I mean, anyone that's read your books and has heard some of the anecdotes that you have spoke of, there are things still even far worse occurring, and things get worse in a lot of ways every day because we're not tackling this. We're not tackling this with a humanistic, empathetic, decent approach,
Yeah, absolutely. There's a Leap UK member, a good friend of mine called Nick Castle. He used to do exactly the same kind of work as I did. He also has PTSD, and he's a lot worse than me. He struggles. He really struggles. And JS and I interviewed him for an article for Filter Mag in the USA. And some of what happened to Nick is extraordinary, but it's not unusual. He has a back injury that he has to have fentanyl patches for because he never gets rid of the pain. And that was from a drug dealing gang that basically jumped him and beat him and left him for dead, kicking his back. And, he has to live with that. And that's what a lot of police are aware of, that drugs, organised crime causes those kind of harm. And, rightly or wrongly, that drives not everybody, but it certainly in some inner city areas, it drives their thinking. And we have to try and unpick where this warlike mentality comes from. It's not so easy for everybody to understand, whether it's the public or a significant number of police, that it's the laws that's brought us to this place. And it takes some of us to explain that to them before they get it. So we have to try and be understanding that no one's perhaps yet explained it to this person yet. No one's actually presented this evidence. No one's actually engaged with them yet. And so it's down to all of us who are part of this movement to try and make the movement grow wherever we can, because that way we get more people to understand and less people get hurt.
I think it's quite hard to I suppose in the Gandhi or Martin Luther King kind of fashion, of respond with not passivity, but not with aggression to aggression. And I think policing, especially so, policing of drugs in the UK, especially so, has become very hyper aggressive in that they don't raid people at 4 a.m. in the same way for financial crimes as they do for the suspected little bit of heroin. You know, the doors are not chainsawed off. There's not 50 men piling through, screaming, tearing people out of bed in their underwear and throwing them around. And it's that people, one of the things I think we've discussed, I asked you actually, I think at the end of something, not even a podcast, some of the other year, and you're like, oh, good question, we should talk about this at some point, was about the media's depiction of the war on drugs and how much that perpetuates and continuates the war on drugs. In that you have then kids growing up watching, you know, Scarface or any sort of pick a more modern referenced movie that glorifies dealing, that glorifies the culture of it, the community. And it's, I don't mean that in the sense of I'm a, you know, perch clutching granny there going, oh, the drugs culture. I mean that this then also shows this aggressive policing of it. And it's often a depiction of reality, but it in some way perpetuates and continues it. Do you know what I mean? Or does it?
Yeah.
That's, I mean, my feeling is that it does anyway.
Well, it's not just the media that does it. It's actually the police that do it themselves, which is why we have to look for new ways to challenge the police narrative. So, you know, the police have done it. They've always done it. They'll present a big seizure as success. It gets in the news. It gets in the tabloid newspapers. And increasingly, it's now on social media where police are almost on a daily basis showing these, you know, the cannabis factory or a big seizure of cocaine or whatever it is. And they're presenting this as success. Now, the trouble is the public see these seizures. And for one, they're reminded that there's something to be scared of. But they're also reassured. They're reassured that the police are doing something about this. So the current system must be working because look what the police are doing. Now, it's not, but it sits without context because the police never present the true context, that it actually has no impact at all. It doesn't reduce crime. In fact, more often than not, it increases crime because it creates a gap in the market where that competition is therefore fought over. It also increases corruption because if you create monopolies by thinning out the competition, more disposable income is in fewer hands, you get more corruption. But these things aren't explained to the public. The context isn't explained. But the public are constantly being lulled into believing that the current system works. And that fact is slowing down the growth of the movement. That is what we are all up against. So we have to find ways of successfully challenging that police narrative. Now, unfortunately, I know there'll be lots of people listening to this who will have seen these social media posts and they will have posted something on that in response that will not be listened to because it's rude or it's a ramble. It's saying too much when saying less would be better. And so that's why with anyone's child, I came up with this idea of responding to something in social media. I don't know if I told you about this before, but it's a short film. I think it's Twitter length, so it's less than 3 minutes, and it's basically designed to be put in the politely. It works if it's used politely. It's designed to be put in the comments underneath these social media posts in response to what these police claims are. And it's actually had real impact because I've had cops contact me from, you know, it's been translated in subtitles into Italian, Spanish, even Mongolian, Cambodian. It's all over the world. And it is actually impacting on police thinking. It's actually doing what we wanted it to. So if anyone out there, please use it every time you see police social media posts. And even if it already sits there in the comments, because repetition is good, you know, repetition of messaging is good. And if we keep using it, it is a genuinely successful response to those police social media posts. Whereas what most people write isn't helpful.
Yeah, you see a lot of people going, shared, hope I win, obviously as a parody of kind of what exists with the cannabis kind of online culture with competitions and other things. So, I mean, some of the humor, obviously, I think, works as well in some context. It does often create kind of your two extremes. So there's somebody really making light heart of it, and then the granny going like, I say granny, I'm sorry, I'm not meaning to be ageist here. I just often find that typically is in this day and age that it is often the older generation who haven't had internet saturation over the past 10 years, that haven't at least bumped into one of these videos, some content that would make them go, huh, or they haven't had some family member or by some extension community member interact with this system. It is typically a lot of the kind of older, what they live in their own kind of bubble. I think me and Tyler Green talk of this in one of the In Conversation videos that we did a couple of months ago. If you want to check that out, folks, I'll try and include that link. If you do send us a link for the Anyone's Child video as well, please, Neil, I'll include that so that people can share it as well. Because I think, yeah, that's a great way to do it. To, again, direct education and repetition works. When people see 7, 8, 9, 20 people share the same video, people start to go, okay, maybe just a little sentence, personalizing it to that bust, to that region, to that drug, to that topic will really entice people in. And as you say, I think the education for me is the ultimate sanitizer here. It will wash away the filth that has been created on all sides to perpetuate this cash cow, this misery machine that is prohibition. People have an innate desire to play with their consciousness, whether it's, I'll stay up late tonight, or, I'll drive faster and feel the adrenaline, I'll jump out of a plane, or I'll take this drug, or I'll do whatever. We have that desire within us to play with and be curious of our consciousness. And I think anything that criminalizes that is a bad thing. And I do hope in the not too distant future that in terms of the sexual renaissance, I guess we've lived through in not too recent eras with homosexual marriage being allowed, the full acceptance basically of the spectrum of sexuality and more of a widened conversation occurring in society. I hope the same happens with drugs. And I think that as an organization, as an entity and group, collective group, LGBTQ plus got to where it got by recognizing that it needed to stop attacking each other. And I think that it's good to see that there are cops inside the wall that are looking at this going, we don't want to do this. I mean, I've seen it when that day at Parliament, when Callie Blackwell got arrested, I made a cop cry for how I got them riled the fuck up because they were horrified. They were having to do their job, but they had nearly 150 people or something gathered around these vans, and you could just feel it. They didn't want to be doing what they were doing. Mm. Right, I suppose we'll move on to the hard topics now, Neil, for the second bit. Where are we currently with this quite scary, quite unknown, actually? It surprises me how many people don't really know what is going on with the creation of this bill, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, I believe it's called.
Yeah, I mean, it's a dystopian nightmare, really. Some of it has been tempered by the work of some people in the Lords, Brian Paddock, Lord Brian Paddock, who's a member of Leap UK, and our good friend, Jenny Jones as well. So, that there is some pushback, but essentially it's a dystopian nightmare, particularly in terms of protest, where within the body of the bill, it's supposedly left to the judgment of police about whether the noise from a protest is considered a nuisance. Now, this is so autocratic and nightmarish, but I compare it with, I've read a lot about the debates for an act that came in 1986, which is the Public Order Act. And within the Public Order Act, there's a section 3 is a fray, someone causing an affray. Now, within that act, the police officer has to make a judgment whether a reasonable person would find the behaviour threatening. So that's the first sort of precedent for police making a judgment in terms of public order. And there was some debate about that, about whether that infringed on whether it was an overreach of the state to do that. And you can see why that debate happened. But the law came into effect and it was very effective, and it's a very useful tool to deal with violent people in the streets. So it played out well, and I don't think that did overstep the mark. But we've got this. But the debates then leading up to that act were much bigger and had much more substance, and there was a real chance that that wouldn't happen. But now there isn't even proper opposition to this act. And this is way further than the Public Order Act of 1986. This is a cop can decide that something's too noisy and therefore the gathering is illegal. It's just, I mean, protest is an essential part of the fabric of our democracy. It's what keeps it fresh and alive and prevents the police becoming a tool of an autocratic regime. And but there's no opposition to this. It's like, it's hard to even express just how batshit crazy it really is, this legislation. But it comes on the heels of some other horrendous legislation, which has slipped by and people don't even know has happened, like the Chiz Act, for example. I mean, the Chiz Act is just a complete nightmare with the powers that have been given to state agents and how the protection against state intervention has just been removed.
So what is the Chiz Act? Sorry, it's slipped past me clearly.
All right. So the Chiz Act, to my mind, it's already an act. It's already got passed. Is even worse than the current bill that you just mentioned, because the Chiz Act essentially gives state agents such as undercover police, like I used to be, and Chizzers, as in police informants, it gives them immunity from prosecution.
Oh, I do remember this.
Now, in announcing the decision not to oppose it from Keir Starmer, he said that the act, all it did is formalise what goes on in practice. Now, considering he was the director of public prosecutions, that is so inaccurate. It's just hard to believe he actually came out with it, because it's not true at all. It not just structurally, literally creates inequality before the law, so that one section of government actors have a different legal status for committing a crime to the rest of the public. For the first time in our nation, there's inequality before the law. Well, since 1215 or whatever, anyway. But it also is an important psychological edge. Now, I know that when I used to work undercover, I knew that my anonymity was a privilege and not a right. And I knew that when I was going to give evidence before Crown Court, the judge for that case would first have to agree to my anonymity and the special measures which protected me in that court case. And I knew that if I made some drastic, unethical or unlawful act during my deployment, then the judge would have to consider that when agreeing to have those special measures to maintain my anonymity, right? So I knew when I was working that I was myself at risk if I didn't navigate the law very carefully. Now, I knew I could break the law, but if I could justify that in the context of what I was doing in the investigation, I would be fine. Mm-hmm. The current law now removes that psychological approach. Mm-hmm. It completely removes it. And I knew that when I was at my most unethical and hardworking, that would have potentially impacted on my behaviour. And I know that there are people that are a lot less ethical than me. And bear in mind that a lot of police informants are just criminals who are trying to reduce their prison sentence. They're suddenly given an immunity from prosecution. It's like, this is dystopian madness. And that's not the only thing in the act. When I would do any undercover operation, my first instruction was that I must not act as an agent provocateur. That's the instruction number one, where it used to be to undercover cops. Within the Chiz Act, it's now legal to be an agent provocateur. It's in the act. So, for example, spy cops, the spy cops investigation is still going on, the Mitting inquiry, it's still going to go on for a few years. They've preempted any decision from that by literally legally allowing any state operative to entrap people, to become an agent provocateur, to cause someone to commit a crime that they wouldn't otherwise have committed. It's now on the statute books. So, and again, that passed most people by. I put weeks and months into trying to stop that act from passing. I worked with Shami Chakrabarti and Brian Paddock and a few other people. I gave briefings to MPs and Lords. And just for the information of people out there, that the only real MP, as in from the Commons, that worked hard to try and stop the act was Stella Creasy. She worked finger and nail on that to try and stop people. She organised the briefings, and I've heard people say some unkind things about her, but the people need to realise just how hard that woman works for our rights behind the scenes. She's a very impressive MP. Okay, she's not so clear yet on drug policy, but she's one to respect. Put it that way.
Okay, well, I'll give her a Google. I've not heard of her, so I will. Definitely give her a Google. Yeah, I'm looking at the bodies now capable of using undercover agents and CCAs. It's quite worrying here, folks. So I'm just going to read you out some of these. And one of the last ones I think might be alarming if you happen to be running a CBD company or trying to figure out where you stand as a CBD company here in the UK. They are any police force, the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, any of the intelligence agencies, HMRC, the Department of Health and Social Care, Home Office, Ministry of Justice, what does that say? Competition and Markets Authority, Environment Agency, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Food Standards Agency, and the Gambling Commission. Why the hell would somebody in the Gambling Commission need to be able to cause another to commit a crime to further an investigation?
Your imagination can have no limits for that, and the imagination the limits of our imagination are no barrier to how much that law can be misused.
So it says here as well that criminal injustice compensation is also denied under the CCA and JCCA, which I'm not sure what those acronyms are. I'm trying to find out on here.
It means you can't get criminal injuries compensation.
So if you're then injured is in the process of an investigation.
Yeah.
And of course, then we've just found out there's an agent. Again, it's like, it's almost the same protections. Not even the same protections are afforded at war. We have war crime commissions. You have all kinds of etiquette, of rules of engagement that I would say would give more of an accountability of ethics than this now does for UK policing.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's terrifying.
It's as bad as it's worse than it sounds. It really is absolutely a dystopian nightmare. It really is. And the fact that there was no opposition in the Commons to that act. None. The only opposition was the Lords.
Yeah, the Labour Shadow Secretary said that the bill addresses a vital issue, providing a clear, lawful framework for the use of human intelligence sources. Yeah, again, it's the language. This is something I'm really bothered by, a lawful framework. So it's carte blanche. It's basically the James Bond license to kill kind of thing.
Yep.
It's again, especially the time that we're in, as you were saying, with authoritarianism, this kind of faux populism creating a call for authoritarianism, for the strongman position that is created ironically out of the same policies that are creating the consequences that mean that people vote for the policies that make the economic situation worse. So we're in this kind of catch-22 with ourselves where
it's actually worse than that. Let me just explain something to you. If as a police officer I wanted to get a search warrant for somebody's house, I would have to explain the evidence, or rather the suspicion and the information which makes me conclude that to an inspector. Then they would authorise me then to apply to the magistrate's clerk where I would have to explain and answer questions to the magistrate clerk and explain why this search warrant was necessary. I would then be allowed to speak to the magistrate and explain to them, and then they would agree or not to sign the search warrant. That's judicial oversight. If I wanted to get a phone tap and listen to your phone conversations, the oversight is actually there's only one person can sign that oversight, and they would have all sorts of advisors to decide whether they should or not. And that's the Home Secretary. Mm-hmm. So that's external oversight. It's judicial oversight. If you want to do an undercover operation where you can send another undercover operative into your life, get to know you, befriend you, empathize with you, manipulate what you do, change your way of thinking, cause you to take political activity, maybe persuade you to do some criminal damage, or, that intrusion, there is no greater intrusion through policing than undercover policing. It's much more intrusive than listening to your phone. It's much more intrusive than searching your house and searching through your underwear drawers. It's much more intrusive than anything, because undercover cops can manipulate you and they can get into your private thoughts, not just what's written, not just what you say on the phone or what's written in your diary. They can get into your thoughts. There is no judicial oversight for that. All of the oversight for undercover operations are within the investigative body. There is no judicial oversight whatsoever. We even have judicial oversight for search warrants. So that's how disturbing that is. Now, if you put that into the context of now that we have this Chiz Act, where there is a blanket immunity ahead of any crime committed, that immunity exists for that crime beforehand, and that there's no one actually judging that anyone outside those policing bodies. And the trouble is, we'll never probably know the full impact of that act now, because there's no one checking up on it. There isn't anybody.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, paired with a concept that I've been trying to get my head around recently, which is something that American law enforcement have been doing to get around these judicial oversights for warrants and for data collection. They are setting up companies and just buying the metadata. They then send the metadata to companies that understand how to extract it and to be able to use markers to individualize it and I think the term is de-anonymize it, and then use that in informed policing. So then it's backdoor hacking and invasive. It's still passive surveillance, and we're in a weird time where I'd kind of prefer passive surveillance than exactly this intrusive kind of redirecting of life. I mean, there's been famous people across the history of the past century, obviously, that have famously been intervened with and then interfered with by the state and then ultimately assassinated by them. And I think they were so high profile because of the mechanisms that were in place to allow that to occur. Whereas now, they have literal carte blanche for that effectively. I'm not trying to be too hyperbole here, but I'm saying that with the corrections or the amendments that they've made to the Police Reform Act 2002 and all of the other subsequent serious crime acts and crime court acts, it retrospectively sets up a huge doorway for correct criminals, approved criminals. My mate David, he's not a bad guy. He's informant, right? Sign him on. Oh yeah. And it creates this huge area for exploitation and a direct network between serious organized crime and policing and politics, as far as I see it. It can only further corruption, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to also recognize that the use of informants is one of the biggest drivers of violence on the streets, because if someone's caught with a load of heroin, they think, I'm going to get 5 years for this. I can't do 5 years. I won't see my kids go to school, and I can't do 5 years. I need to get some time off my sentence. And so he's sat in the cell knowing that there's going to be 2 detectives come through that cell door and they're going to offer him a deal. So he's thinking, I have to give them some information to get a couple of years off my sentence. So who am I least scared of that I can provide information to them about? Who am I least scared of that isn't likely to torture me to death at the slightest suspicion that I gave them some information? And so that mechanism of thought and that transactional conversation between the would-be informant and the source handlers that are in the police is a major, major driver of the violence on the streets because, of course, every person out there knows that transaction happens, that conversation happens. And so they strive to be the most brutal, ruthless, and intimidating, because if you are the most brutal, ruthless, and intimidating, you're not the one who gets grassed up. So this Darwinian situation means that the very use of informants within the drug market is one of the biggest drivers of that violence. And that's not complicated. That is how it plays out. It's not complicated, but we need the wider public to understand this, that trying to police this problem is causing the problems that we perceive, that we see.
What do you think on the timing of this, given obviously, as you were discussing the Spy Cops investigation, of, women were pregnant, children were born of these relationships, and there is an understanding that is becoming ever more factual, I guess, and proven by the record, the disproportionate infiltration of, let's use the typical neoliberalistic bird of left-wing, right-wing, of left-wing organizations. Far more influence was then put into, I'm talking about sort of political interventions here, of now with these kind of powers, you could easily identify a group that, we don't like their thinking, we don't like their dogma, their doctrine. Let's get a couple of people in there, and as you said, quickly incentivizing through agent provocateur tactics, set them on a path towards criminality that then, other officers can engage with, and boom, you're arrested and you're taken out of society. I think that's scary. That then leads to, using that same arms race mechanism you've just described, a culture where either things are occurring in such secrecy, or that then again there is another form of detachment of I don't want to say warfare, of violence, but then ultimately, if the state is threatening violence, then the radicals that arrive. I mean, I think of the JFK quote, those that make a peaceful revolution impossible make a violent revolution inevitable. And I just worry that knowing these tactics, knowing what can occur and how these infiltrations occur in these groups, is then going to affect their tactics, their worldview, and any revolutions to come, should we say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a cynical political response to the Mitting inquiry, the Spy Cops inquiry, because it preempts and goes in the wrong direction for much of the conclusions that are inevitable from the inquiry. And in terms of the political direction, it's murky. It's really murky where the political direction is, because in the history of the Spy Cops, only 4% of their deployments were against right-wing organizations. 4%, all the rest. And yet there was a massive infiltration in anti-racist groups. They infiltrated London Greenpeace, for God's sake. These are the kind of organizations they were infiltrating, but they weren't infiltrating the racist. Well, only 4% of the deployments were to the right wing. So, that begs the question: where exactly is that political direction coming from? Because it's not clear. You could say that the Metropolitan Police that ran those operations, it's hard to conclude that they're not politically motivated, but it's impossible to see where those motivations come from. So I wonder if we will ever get an analysis and a breakdown of where the instructions came from and in what manner those instructions came from to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, which ran those operations. It's murky. And as I say, the Chiz Act is a cynical preemptive strike to maintain those intrusive state powers.
Yeah, like we said, retrospectively, with these change of the various subsequent acts, it will make it illegal. So even if there is criminality and liability found, there is exemption from prosecution and from criminal liability and any compensation, as we've just discussed. So it's cynical is the lightest way of putting it, I think. And I suppose this kind of leads me on to this point of, I guess, generalized sort of respect or attitudes towards the police. If you haven't grown up anywhere near drugs or anywhere near kind of those kind of things, a cop is just a cop typically, you know what I mean? Because they're not really in someone's life. If you haven't grown up with a volatile family situations, you have domestic, or like I said, there's drugs or problematic alcohol consumption or something like that, that means you have this kind of intervention. Typically a cop is just something you see, you know, your parents are going, Nino, Nino, with the sound of the siren or whatever. And it's benign as hell. But then there are others that grow up with their fathers and their brothers being persecuted, you know, their moms beating cops as they're dragging their husbands away out the door, and they see them as this enemy and this monster, and they're part of this apparatus. And as we spoke of, they are still humans beneath their uniforms. But then we're starting to see at the minute a raft of content, obviously, as everyone, and especially youngins, have got smartphones recording all of this stuff. There was a disgusting video that was shared last week, the week before, of a PCSO openly masturbating in a park in London. And it started this raft of sort of feedback and conversations within various comment sections of people going, well, what the fuck are PCSOs? No one, it seems that or the majority of people from these comment sections anyway, have no respect for the concept of it. Yet we're now seeing, I saw a statistic of 80,000 people have applied for various policing positions. I know that's entirely political PR, it was in one of the more right-wing papers. But then what are they going to be recruited? If they're all just going to recruit them as PCSOs, they're quite ineffectual in terms of not having a warrant card. They're very obviously seemingly disrespected by the general public, and especially by the youth, who grow up every day to become the middle-aged, the middle class, the next. Do you know what I mean? So I'm just wondering what we think the future of that's going to look like if they continue down this road.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to make this the last response, I think, Simp. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But yeah, I mean, you've asked a lot there, and you've made some. No, you've made some good points. I mean, look, you mentioned Peel's principles earlier on, and Peel's principle number 7 is that the police are the public, and the public are the police. The police are merely the people who wear the uniform. And if you remove our prohibition drug laws from society, then Peel's principle number 7 essentially works, because but our drug laws have pitted the police against a significant minority of the population. It's made them an occupying force in communities where people use different drugs to others, and you can't get around that. And our current drug laws have just torn up Peel's principles. You know, the man will be turning in his grave, I am sure, because they are so well crafted, and so it's almost like, if you look at the wording of them, it's like they could have predicted the risk of prohibition within them. So, but in terms of PCSOs, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I worked with some great PCSOs who did some of this community engagement that the police didn't do anymore. So, you know, I've only seen good things from PCSOs, to be honest. And they were the brainchild of David Blunkett, weren't they? Sheffield MP. And his idea, his thinking was about trying to reconnect communities with police and them being a sort of community arm of police. Now, that's great in principle, but it's going in the wrong direction, because you can't really connect the police with every community until you get rid of our drug laws and start treating everybody equally, you know, and treat everybody, what people do with their own mind and body, as equal to other people. So great in principle, but again, it's just going down the wrong direction. Now, as for the PCSO wanking in a park, well, I mean, you know, police are a cross section of society, and you know, there are people who commit sexual offences right across that society. So, you know, that there may well, there is a problem with misogyny and prejudice within policing, and it does need reforming. But the extent to which sexual offences are more likely within policing as to the wider public, I've not seen any evidence of that. I've not seen any reason why it should be, really. I mean, people should realise just how common sexual offences are. I mean, God, the stuff I investigated. Well, I don't miss it. Put it this way: I really do not miss investigating child sexual offences, rapes, historical child sexual offences, and it was always a little bit disturbing just how common sexual offences are or were. I mean, but one comment I would make, especially in light of the recent rape and murder, with cousins, the convicted men.
Sarah Everard.
Yes, with that, the police made a drastic error there in the fact that he was being investigated for indecent exposure. And any detective knows that indecent exposure is a triggering offence for more serious sexual violence. A significant number of rapists started off with exposing themselves. And there is a well-established criminology link between those crimes, so that anybody who exposes themselves should be seen as a significantly enhanced risk for much more serious sexual crimes. And so for the fact that policing institutions have known that for a very long time means that any ignoring of that increased risk is a serious dereliction of duty, serious. And so I hope that PCSO is being looked at in those serious terms.
You and me both, and I think it's quite an apt way to end this podcast by saying there are wankers in all parts of society, and I think it's true. Again, if anything is taken from this, guys, you know me and my stance with police. If you've seen me at an event where cops turn up, I am the first there shouting at them and having a good old conversation, but I'm trying to recognize more and more, and I hope you guys do as well, humanity in the uniform, and that ultimately people like Neil, I think, are capable of pushing for reform. And there are organizations out there that, for all we still see the blue lights and hear the sirens and have that fear, there are champions out there that they do have our ear. So it's good. Right, well,
thanks, Simpa. Just a reminder that we at LEAP are nothing without our allies and nothing without support, and we are just one part of a very big movement. And every activist out there I consider as my ally and friend. So, let's continue working together and supporting each other. So thanks, mate. Yeah,
anytime, brother, anytime. I'll include all the links and stuff for people to find you below. I'll let you get on with the rest of your bank holiday, and I'll say goodbye to these fine folks. So that means you can leave, Neil. Cheers, brother. Bye.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.
Hey, perfect. So I can never find the eject button from this, and especially more so now. I don't know if you noticed. I'm flipped. I kind of moved around. I wanted a bit more room. You probably see. I started doing the weights. Not that you can tell. But yeah, I enjoyed that. That was wonderful. I do enjoy my conversations with Neil Woods. I think it is important to remind ourselves that we are enemies by the creation of an act that was written into legislation over 50 years ago at this point, over 60 years ago at this point. Like, we need to be mindful that when that war ends, there still are humans on the other side of that. And it's interesting that Neil brought up the concept that basically, everybody else is represented. Anyone else can be a police officer in this country, except an active and open drug consumer. And so therefore we are one of the last major groups that face this active persecution from this mass institution. And so therefore we need to kind of unify for our rights, and our right to be high, our right to exist, our right to congregate, to create cultures, to create good times, to create art, to just explore our consciousness, to get high, to discuss the bigger picture, see what it is to be human, stare into a fire, dance barefoot in the woods, whatever it is the fuck we want to do. You know what I mean? We should be free to do it. So I hope you are going to do so over the next week, and I will see you fine folks next week for... We've got some notes. We have Clock French next week, folks, from the United Patients Alliance. Going to be quite an interesting conversation. Going to be covering a lot of different topics and, catching up on 2017, 2018, kind of how things occurred during that time and how we ended up with the laws that we did in the UK and what Clark wants to do to help change them for better access and for better policies, basically, for your average cannabis patient here in the UK. So, yeah, if you've enjoyed this, please do check us out on patreon.com/Simpa Life. We're available everywhere on the internet at Simpa Life. Do like, share, subscribe, rate if you're listening to this on Apple, Google, or I think we're now on Amazon as well. Hello, Amazon people. I don't know why I'm waving. You'll be hearing me. But yeah, do hope you have enjoyed this. And yeah, peace, love. Have a wonderful week. And see you guys later. It's not quite a mic drop, it'll do.